Daniel grew up in a small town in East Tennessee, the kind of place where everybody knows whose family has been there for generations and whose hasn't, where the landscape is mostly hills and trees and narrow roads that wind through valleys between them. He said growing up there, you develop a specific relationship with old buildings. There are a lot of them. Old farmhouses, old barns, old structures that have been sitting in fields and at the edges of forests for longer than anyone currently alive can remember. You grow up around them, and they become part of the background. You stop seeing them the way an outsider would. He said he'd driven past the old church on Route 9 his entire life without really looking at it. It sat about a quarter-mile back from the road, at the end of a dirt track that had mostly grown over. White clapboard siding gone gray and patchy. A simple steeple that had lost its cross at some point. You could see where it had been mounted, the bracket still there, the cross itself long gone. A small cemetery to the left of the building, maybe 30 or 40 markers, the oldest ones so weathered they were barely legible. A few old oak trees, enormous, their roots probably older than the church itself. He didn't know the history of it specifically. He knew it had been out of use for a long time, his whole life at least, probably much longer. He'd never heard anyone mention it. It was just one of those structures that exists in rural areas, slowly being reclaimed by the landscape, no longer anyone's problem or anyone's place. He said he'd driven past it 1,000 times. He stopped there for the first time on a Tuesday evening in late October. He'd been out to visit a friend who lived further up Route 9 and was driving back toward town as it was getting dark. He said the visit had run longer than he planned, and by the time he was on the road, it was that specific quality of early evening dark that happens fast in October in the hills, not full night yet, but the light gone flat and gray and dropping quickly. He was passing the old church when he saw something that made him slow down and then stop. There was a light inside the building. Not a bright light, dim, warm, the kind of quality that suggested candle or lantern rather than electric. It was visible through one of the side windows of the church, a long, narrow window that he'd never paid attention to before. The light was moving slightly, shifting the way firelight or candlelight shifts. He pulled over to the shoulder of Route 9 and sat with the engine running, looking at the light through the trees. His first thought was kids. Rural old buildings attract teenagers the way they always have, somewhere to go, somewhere private, somewhere that feels transgressive without being genuinely dangerous. He'd done it himself at that age. It wasn't something he felt the need to intervene in. But he kept looking at the light, and the longer he looked, the less it seemed like something teenagers would produce. It was too still, he said, controlled, moving in a rhythm that felt deliberate rather than casual. And there was something else, something he noticed after a minute of watching that he couldn't immediately explain. No sound. He'd cracked his window to listen. If there were teenagers in that building, there'd be talking, laughing, music from a phone. The kind of noise young people make when they think no one can hear them. But the church was silent. The light moved and the church was silent. He sat there for another couple of minutes. The rational part of his brain was generating explanations, a property caretaker, someone doing a survey of the building, a local historian checking the condition of the interior. All reasonable, all possible. He turned off his engine. He got out of his car. He said he's not sure exactly what made him get out. He said it wasn't really curiosity, or not only curiosity. It was more like the specific feeling of something being slightly wrong that you can't name, and the decision to get close enough to name it so you can stop feeling it. He just wanted to see what the light was. Then he could drive home. He walked down the dirt track toward the church. The ground was damp from recent rain, and his footsteps were quiet. It was dark enough now that the church was mostly a shape against the darker tree line, the light in the window more visible as the ambient light faded. He stayed to the side of the track as he approached, moving toward the cemetery side of the building rather than the front entrance. He reached the edge of the cemetery and stopped. He was close enough now to see the window clearly. The light was inside. That was definite, coming from somewhere toward the front of the interior, the altar end of the building. He couldn't see the source directly from the angle he was at. He moved along the cemetery fence line toward the front of the church, staying in the shadow of the oak trees. He was passing the oldest section of the cemetery, the markers so old and weathered they were barely standing, when he heard something inside the church. A voice. Low, single voice, not a conversation. Speaking in a rhythm that was almost musical but not quite. He said the closest thing he could compare it to was someone reading aloud, but not in a way that sounded like reading. More like reciting. Something memorized, said in a specific cadence, over and over. He couldn't make out words. He couldn't even be certain it was English. He stood completely still between two of the old grave markers and listened. The voice continued. Steady, low, rhythmic. The light continued moving in its controlled way through the window. He stood there for probably 2 minutes just listening, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Then the voice stopped. Complete silence. The light stopped moving. It was still there, visible through the window, but it had gone still. Daniel said that was the moment things shifted. Because up until the voice stopped, he had something to track sound and light, two things to organize his understanding around. When the voice stopped and the light stopped moving, he had nothing. Just silence and a still glow in a window. And in that silence he became suddenly and acutely aware of how alone he was. Rural road, full dark now, no other cars, no other lights in any direction. Just him and the trees and the old gravestones and the church. He made the decision to go back to his car. He started moving back along the cemetery fence line the way he'd come. Quietly. He said he was being careful about his footsteps without making a conscious decision to be careful. His body was ahead of his brain on the whole situation. He was halfway back to the dirt track when the front door of the church opened. He stopped moving. The door had opened inward. He could see the rectangle of slightly warmer dark inside the church through the doorway. No one came out. The door just opened and stayed open. He stood between two grave markers and didn't move and didn't breathe. A figure appeared in the doorway. He said it stood in the doorframe and seemed to be looking out, but the dark was dense enough by that point that he couldn't see its face, couldn't make out any real detail. It was a person-sized shape in a doorway. That was all he could say with certainty. He stood completely still. He was in the shadow of the oak trees, and he had not made noise coming back, and he was wearing dark clothing. He told himself there was a reasonable chance he hadn't been seen. He told himself to stay still and wait. The figure stood in the doorway for what he estimated was about a minute. Not moving, just standing there, facing outward into the dark. Then it stepped back inside. The door did not close. Daniel waited another full minute. Then he moved. He went back along the fence line to the dirt track and he walked fast, not running. He said he was afraid running would make noise that would carry back to Route 9 and to his car. He got in, started the engine, and drove. He didn't look back at the church as he passed it. He kept his eyes on the road and drove, and didn't stop until he was in town with streetlights and other cars around him. He told his wife when he got home. She listened carefully, the way she always did, and then asked him the question he said he'd been avoiding asking himself the whole drive back. She asked him why the door opened. Not who opened it. Why? As in, if there was a person in that church doing whatever they were doing, and Daniel had been standing outside in the dark and the silence for several minutes, what would cause that person to come to the door and look outside? He said he hadn't made noise. He was certain of that. He'd been careful and the ground was damp and he hadn't spoken. But she pointed out something he hadn't considered. His car. He'd parked on the shoulder of Route 9, visible from the dirt track leading to the church. He turned off his engine and gotten out. If someone inside that church had been watching the road, which, if they were doing something they didn't want seen, they might well have been doing, They would have seen a car pull over and stop. They would have seen the headlights go off. They would have known someone got out and walked toward the church. The voice stopping, the light going still, the door opening. Not random, sequential. The sequence of someone who knew they were being watched and was deciding what to do about it. Daniel said he and his wife sat with that for a while. Then she asked the second question. She asked him what he thought would have happened if the figure in the doorway had seen him. He said he didn't know. He said he hoped the answer was nothing, that it was someone doing something embarrassing or illegal in a minor way, and they'd have been more scared of him than he was of them. He said he hoped that was the answer. He said he doesn't fully believe it, though. He went back in the daytime 2 weeks later. He said he had to. He said the not knowing was worse than going back. It was a clear November morning when he pulled down the dirt track and parked in front of the church. In daylight, it looked exactly as it always had, gray and weathered and still, the cemetery quiet and cold, the oak trees bare of leaves by that point, their branches black against a white sky. He tried the front door. It opened without resistance. The latch was broken, had been for years probably. He went inside. The interior was what you'd expect from a building that had been abandoned for decades. Pews still in place, most of them, though some had collapsed. A raised area at the front where the altar would have been, the altar itself long gone. Old hymnals on the floor, swollen with moisture, unreadable. Leaves that had blown in through broken windows, deep in the corners. Everything covered in a layer of dust and time that suggested no one had been inside in years. Almost everything. At the front of the church, in the area where the altar had been, the dust on the floor was disturbed. Not the disturbance of random footprints, something more deliberate. A roughly circular area, maybe 4 feet across, where the dust had been cleared or swept away. In the center of this cleared circle, a ring of old candle wax on the floor. Not one candle, several, placed in a pattern, burned down to nothing. The wax was dark and old-looking. But when Daniel crouched down and looked closely, he could see that some of the wax had run down over other, older wax. Recent candles burned in a spot that had been used before. He stood up and looked at the cleared circle and the wax for a long time. Then he noticed something on the wall behind where the altar had been. The wall had old painted text on it, scripture, he thought, though it was so faded it was almost entirely illegible. But below the scripture, at about shoulder height, something had been added to the wall. Not painted. Written. In something dark, he chose not to examine too closely what it had been written with. A list. Names, he thought. Handwritten vertically down the wall, maybe 20 or 30 of them, in a handwriting that was careful and deliberate. He didn't recognize any of the names. Some of them looked old, the style of the names, the quality of what they'd been written with, and some of them looked newer. At the bottom of the list, the last entry, the ink or whatever it was still slightly darker than the entries above it. A name, and next to it a date. The date was 2 days before the night Daniel had stopped on Route 9 and seen the light in the window. He didn't touch anything. He took photographs on his phone and left. He drove to the county sheriff's office and spoke to a deputy and showed him the photographs. The deputy drove out to the property with him that same afternoon. The deputy confirmed what was in the photographs. He took his own photographs and said he'd look into the property records and check if there had been any similar reports in the area. He called Daniel 3 days later. He said the property had no registered owner. It had passed through several hands over the decades since the congregation disbanded and had eventually lapsed into the kind of administrative ambiguity that old rural properties sometimes fall into, where it's not clearly anyone's responsibility. He said there had been no previous reports of activity there. He said without evidence of an actual crime, trespassing on an unowned property was difficult to prosecute. There wasn't much official action he could take. He said he'd have a patrol car go by on Route 9 periodically and keep an eye on it. Then he said something that Daniel said he almost didn't catch because it was said quickly and quietly at the end of the call, almost like an aside. He said some of the names on that wall were names he recognized. Old names, families from the county. He said one of them was the name of a man who had gone missing from a town about 30 miles away, about 4 years ago. Missing persons case, never resolved. The name was on the wall, no date next to it, just the name. Daniel asked the deputy what he thought it meant. There was a long pause. The deputy said he didn't know. He said he was going to make some calls. Daniel never heard back from him. He drives a different route home now. He said it adds about 12 minutes to the drive, but he takes it without thinking, the way you develop habits around things you don't want to examine too closely. He said his wife sometimes asks if he wants to talk about it, and he says no, and she understands. He said the thing he comes back to most often, the image that surfaces at 2 a.m. when he can't sleep, isn't the light in the window. It isn't the voice, or the figure in the doorway, or the circle of wax on the floor. It's the list on the wall. Specifically the last name. The newest entry, the ink still dark, added 2 days before he happened to stop on that road. He said he thinks about the person whose name that is, whether they know, whether they're still around to know, whether the name on the wall means something was done, or something was planned, or something was wished for in whatever dark and private ritual was performed in that circle by candlelight on a Tuesday night in October. He said he searched the name online. He won't say what he found. He said some answers make the question worse. Whatever is happening in that old church on Route 9 has been happening for a long time. The layers of wax said so. The older names on the wall said so. Daniel stopped there on one random evening and got close enough to hear it and see it, and then had the good sense, or the good luck, to get back to his car. He said he thinks about the door opening, the figure standing in it, the fact that he was in the shadow of those oak trees and the figure looked out into the dark and didn't see him. He said he hopes that's true. He hopes it didn't see him. Because if it did, if it stood in that doorway and looked directly at where he was crouching between those old grave markers and simply chose not to do anything about it, then the question isn't whether he got away. The question is why it let him. That's Daniel's story. Rural America has thousands of structures like that old church on Route 9, buildings that outlasted their purpose, that sit at the edges of communities and country roads, that nobody owns and nobody tends and nobody talks about. Most of them are exactly what they appear to be: empty, forgotten, slowly falling down. But some of them, apparently, are still being used. For something. By someone. And on a dark October evening on a back road in Tennessee, Daniel got close enough to hear it, that low, rhythmic voice in the candlelight, before the silence swallowed everything again and a door swung open in the dark. He made it back to his car. He tries not to think about the list on the wall. He tries not to think about his name, whether it's on it, whether it will be.